Hello everyone, Mr. Linder here. Let's talk about gas transport in the respiratory system and the importance of the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. So when we look at the respiratory system, it's important to focus on the diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide across cell membranes and how they're transported in the cardiovascular system. If for some reason the movement of gases in the respiratory system and within the cardiovascular system is impaired, we would result in conditions that we call hypoxia, which hypoxia is a decrease in oxygen levels within the body. Or we may also see hypercapnia, which hypercapnia is an increase in carbon dioxide levels within the human body. And the reason we would see these things is because in the respiratory system, we're looking at bringing oxygen into the cardiovascular system, and we're looking to get rid of carbon dioxide. So if the respiratory system and gas transport is impaired, we would assume we would see lower levels of oxygen and increased levels of carbon dioxide within the body. And so that's going to be some clinical signs that could assist us in disease diagnosis. In order to monitor what's going on in the respiratory system and essentially the cardiovascular system as it relates to gases, is that we use chemoreceptors. So chemoreceptors are important for monitoring the levels of carbon dioxide, oxygen, so monitoring the respiratory gases, as well as looking at hydrogen ion levels. Because hydrogen ion levels give us an indication of pH, and they are related to the levels of carbon dioxide that we have in the circulatory system. So CO2 mixing in water will give us carbonic acid, and carbonic acid can dissociate into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. So there's a relationship between carbon dioxide levels and hydrogen ion levels. And so chemoreceptors are going to be monitoring carbon dioxide, oxygen, and hydrogen ion levels in our arterial blood, even in our cerebrospinal fluid, to ensure that we have homeostasis so we can determine if the respiratory system is functioning properly. The movement of respiratory gases, so when we look at how gases move in the respiratory system, we really want to focus on partial pressures. So this particular diagram represents various partial pressures of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So the first portion is partial pressure of oxygen in the air that we breathe, and partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So you'll notice that the partial pressure of oxygen is much higher out in the atmosphere than levels of carbon dioxide. Gases are going to move from high pressures to low pressures. So looking at this diagram, we can see how the movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide is going to occur. If we have a higher level of partial pressure of oxygen in the air that we breathe, that means that it's going to move into the alveoli because the alveoli have a lower partial pressure of oxygen, so 160 to 100. And then, of course, oxygen is going to move from the alveoli into arterial blood because there is a partial pressure difference. And we're also going to be talking about hemoglobin levels and the using hemoglobin to grab onto oxygen to transport it through the cardiovascular system. If we look at partial pressures of carbon dioxide, you'll notice that the partial pressure for carbon dioxide is greater in the venous blood, lower in the alveoli, and then lower in the atmosphere. So that shows us that we're going to be moving carbon dioxide out of the body. So oxygen in, carbon dioxide out, as we look at the general functioning of the respiratory system and gas transport in the cardiovascular system. In order to essentially move oxygen efficiently, we have to look at several factors. So alveolar gas exchange for oxygen is going to be influenced by how much oxygen reaches the alveoli, our ability to diffuse oxygen from the alveoli into arterial blood, and adequate perfusion to the alveoli. So how well are we pumping blood from the heart? How well is our pulmonary circuit working so that we actually get adequate blood from the heart to the respiratory system so that we can move oxygen from the air that we breathe into the circulatory system. If we look at the oxygen reaching the alveoli, that is partially dependent upon the composition of the air that we breathe. So adequate oxygen reaching the alveoli and ensuring that we get oxygen into our arterial blood is going to be dependent upon the partial pressures of the air that we breathe. If there was a decrease in the partial pressure of oxygen that we're breathing, that means there's going to be less oxygen available to our blood. So inspired air that has lower partial pressures of oxygen results in less oxygen reaching our blood, and we would experience hypoxia. A great example of this would just be looking at altitude. As we increase altitude, there's going to be a lower atmospheric pressure, and so that's going to affect the ability of oxygen to get into our circulatory system, and it's going to affect our overall amount of oxygen available for the body. Another thing to look at is our rate and depth of breathing. How does that affect how much oxygen we get? Well, for example, hypoventilation, so breathing less, that should be an obvious indicator to you. If you're hypoventilating, then you're not going to be bringing in as much oxygen into the cardiovascular system, and that's going to affect the amount of oxygen available to our cells for generating ATP. So alveolar ventilation is affected by how we breathe. It's also affected by airway resistance. You can think of COPD conditions, you can think of asthma, lung compliance, fibrotic conditions. So there's going to be a lot of different things that affect the ability to get oxygen into the cardiovascular system. So let's take a look at some things that would lead to hypoxia. So again, hypoxia is decreased oxygen within the cardiovascular system. And then we'll look at normal physiology and how oxygen binds to hemoglobin and we actually get the oxygen that our cells need. But let's take a look at what could be happening in the respiratory system. So under normal lung function, right, we just simply look at normal partial pressures of oxygen reaching the alveoli, which is going to result in a normal movement of oxygen into our cardiovascular system so that we have adequate saturation. We typically work at about 98% oxygen saturation of our hemoglobin, and that's going to allow us to move a large amount of oxygen to our cells, to our tissues, so that our cells and tissues, organs can function properly. So any problem, though, in the transfer of oxygen gas to the capillaries is going to lead to hypoxia. So what are some things that we can look at? Well, we can look at the diffusion, right? We can look at diffusion rate of oxygen into the circulatory system being affected by things like surface area, concentration gradients, barrier permeability, so how well does the gas get across the membranes, even the diffusion distance. All of these things can affect how we get oxygen into the circulatory system and could lead to hypoxia. So in healthy individuals, concentration gradient is our primary factor for gas exchange. We just look at partial pressure of oxygen, and we ensure that we have the right amount of oxygen moving into the circulatory system. But what about conditions like emphysema or fibrotic lung disease or pulmonary edema or asthma? How do those conditions lead to hypoxia? So in emphysema, we're looking at destruction of the alveoli, meaning essentially we have less surface area for overall gas exchange. And that's because the elastic fibers of the lungs are leading to high compliance because of the destruction of those elastic fibers. So we have high compliance but low elastic recoil. And so our lungs are filling up with air, but it's affecting the ability for the oxygen to move from the alveoli into the circulatory system. So we see changes in surface area, thus reducing gas exchange and lowering the amount of oxygen that reaches the blood. In fibrotic lung diseases, we may see a thickening of the alveolar wall, which is changing essentially the diffusion barrier. It's affecting the permeability of the gases. And so diffusing through scar tissue is going to be slower, and so less oxygen is going to get into the cardiovascular system. So we're seeing lower oxygen in emphysema, we're seeing lower oxygen in fibrotic lung diseases, and so we're getting hypoxia that results. In pulmonary edema, this has to do with fluid accumulation inside the alveoli or in the interstitial spaces surrounding the alveoli. So here we have fluid accumulation. And so this is essentially affecting the diffusion distance. It's also creating a situation where oxygen has to solubilize in a fluid, and it does not do that as readily as something like carbon dioxide would. And so that oxygen is having a difficult time diffusing across this fluid and getting into the circulatory system. And so pulmonary edema, swelling within the lungs, is affecting how oxygen can get into the circulatory system. We actually see pulmonary edema caused by left-sided congestive heart failure. We see it when there's mitral valve problems within the heart, and we also see it when the lungs suffer from inflammatory conditions. So anything that can lead to fluid in the lungs can affect the oxygen transport into the circulatory system and lead to hypoxia. And then in asthma, we see that increased airway resistance decreases the amount of oxygen reaching the alveoli, which thus is going to, again, affect how much oxygen gets into the circulatory system. So all of these different conditions lead to hypoxia in the cardiovascular system, and that's going to affect the function of cells, tissues, and organs within the body. So how do we prevent these conditions from taking place? How does normal physiology actually keep the saturation of oxygen high? So we need to look at the things that affect oxygen transport, and we really want to focus on how oxygen binds to hemoglobin. And this is where we can talk about the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. So the amount of oxygen that is binding to hemoglobin is really going to depend on the partial pressure of oxygen. So number one, how much oxygen binds to hemoglobin is determined by the partial pressure of oxygen. that gets into essentially in the arterial plasma, and that's going to affect how much oxygen is available to bind to hemoglobin. And then number two, the number of hemoglobin binding sites. So the amount of hemoglobin, so binding sites is determined by hemoglobin content in our red blood cells, and also the number of red blood cells that we have. So clearly conditions that we call anemias are going to affect our total number of hemoglobin binding sites. So in normal physiology, though, we're focused on number one, what is the partial pressure of oxygen? And that's going to affect how much oxygen is available to hemoglobin. And number two, we're concerned with essentially how many hemoglobin binding sites do we have, and that's hemoglobin content and the number of red blood cells. A way to demonstrate that to you is to look at a diagram like this. This is showing us how partial pressure and also availability of hemoglobin affects how much oxygen we can actually transport in the cardiovascular system. So plasma partial pressure of oxygen oftentimes is the primary factor for determining percent saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen. So partial pressure of oxygen obviously is very important, but how much hemoglobin we have is also very important as well. So partial pressure of oxygen available to the body is affected by the air that we breathe, our ventilation rate, and how well we exchange gases between the alveoli and the circulatory system. So let's take a look at these diagrams. In the first diagram, what we see is partial pressure of oxygen that we are breathing in relationship to partial pressure of oxygen in the blood. So in this scenario, this would be without hemoglobin. So there's no hemoglobin in this scenario. It's just saying the alveolar partial pressure and the arterial partial pressure are equal to each other. So we are only getting oxygen into the circulatory system based on how much oxygen can dissolve in our blood. So it's based on the solubility of oxygen in water, right? Because our blood is primarily made of water. So this is a scenario without hemoglobin. And so what you'll notice is we can dissolve about 3 milliliters of oxygen per liter of blood. There's no oxygen being transported in the red blood cells because there's no hemoglobin. So our total amount of oxygen carrying capacity is only the 3 milliliters of oxygen per liter of blood that gets dissolved in the circulatory system. That's actually a very, very small amount. Let's take a look at oxygen transport at normal partial pressures of oxygen, but we have hemoglobin in our red blood cells. So again, here's the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli. It's at 100. So we're getting a partial pressure in the blood of 100 millimeters of mercury. We get our 3 mils of oxygen per liter of blood dissolved within the blood plasma. But now, because there's hemoglobin in red blood cells, we're able to bind oxygen with the hemoglobin. And you can see we get a huge amount of oxygen being transported in the cardiovascular system. We're going to add another 197 milliliters of oxygen per liter of blood. So that gives us a grand total of 200 milliliters of oxygen per liter of blood. That's a huge increase because we're using hemoglobin as something to bind to oxygen and transport it so that we don't have to rely on just dissolving oxygen in blood, because the oxygen solubility in blood is not very high. Carbon dioxide in water dissolves very freely, and it's greater than oxygen. So oxygen does not dissolve very well in water So we need something to transport that oxygen to increase how much oxygen we can transport. So when hemoglobin is present, so with hemoglobin, we see that we can carry large amounts of oxygen. In the last scenario, this shows you the importance of the partial pressure of oxygen. So here we have the air that we breathe, partial pressure at 28 millimeters of mercury. That means that we have 28 millimeters of mercury of oxygen in the arterial blood. We still have hemoglobin in our red blood cells, but notice the amount of oxygen dissolved in the blood goes down because there's a much smaller, there's a decreased, right, partial pressure of oxygen. So there's less available oxygen to our blood. We're still able, though, to bind oxygen to hemoglobin. Okay, so that's 99.5 milliliters of oxygen per liter of blood, about 0.8 milliliters of oxygen per liter of blood that just dissolves directly into the blood plasma. So that gives us a grand total of 100.3 milliliters of oxygen per liter of blood. That's a good number, but that is 50% of normal. So when you have a dramatic drop in partial pressure of oxygen in the air that you're breathing, you can see a huge drop in the amount of oxygen carried out to your cells and to your tissues. Where do we see these extreme drops in partial pressure? Well, we see that in altitude. So let me show you an example here, and then we'll go back to that oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. When you have an increase in altitude, so here we have sea level and then moving up to 30,000 feet. When you move up in altitude, there's a clear drop in the partial pressure of oxygen in the air that we breathe. And that's based on a decrease in atmospheric pressure. So as atmospheric pressure goes down, there's going to be less partial pressure of oxygen in the air that we breathe. And so when that level gets low, then we're seeing much less oxygen in the alveoli, which means that you have much less oxygen in arterial blood. What does that mean in terms of our ability to carry oxygen? So let's look at this table. So when you have an extreme drop in the partial pressure of oxygen in arterial blood, our ability to carry oxygen goes down dramatically. So we're seeing when you get into that partial pressure of oxygen being at, say, 28 millimeters of mercury, that's why we're seeing a 50% oxygen carrying capacity. So high altitudes can be very dangerous for humans because we can't move as much oxygen that we normally do out to our cells, our tissues, our organs to sustain life. That 30,000 feet number, we're talking about, say, the top of Mount Everest. We're talking about flying in airplanes. So when you board an airplane, you have to pressurize the cabin before takeoff so that you can breathe at a normal pressure, a normal atmospheric pressure, so you can oxygenate your blood properly and get enough oxygen out to your cells, your tissues, and your organs. So when partial pressure drops significantly, you can see saturation points of only, say, 50%. So the total number of binding sites, if you're going to look at total number of binding sites, that's obviously dependent upon how much hemoglobin you have and how many red blood cells you have. And we can see, going back to this diagram, we can see how important hemoglobin is, because we can carry much more oxygen when we have hemoglobin. And so obviously how many red blood cells we have is very significant. So any pathology that decreases hemoglobin or decreases the number of red blood cells is going to affect your oxygen carrying capacity. So how do we normally move oxygen using hemoglobin. So this is the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. And so I want you guys to take a look at the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve and understand the significance of this curve. So what this shows us is it shows us the percent saturation of hemoglobin at different partial pressures of oxygen. So here we have partial pressure of oxygen, and then we have percent saturation of hemoglobin. So what's going on here? Basically, we're saying that at a given partial pressure, so let's say 100 is the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli. At a given partial pressure, we can maximize the binding sites with hemoglobin, and so we can carry larger amounts of oxygen out to our cells, our tissues, and our organs. So at a partial pressure of oxygen of 100, you'll notice that we're way up here at 98% saturation. What's interesting, though, about this curve is that it's not linear. Okay, we have a dissociation curve that is sigmoidal in shape. That means that even as the partial pressure declines, so even as we go down to 90, 80, 70, we're still seeing high saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen. We can stay above that 90% line. And so here's the 90% line. So even with partial pressures dropping, we can still stay at a high level of saturation and carry large amounts of oxygen. So again, going back to the altitude chart, so even as atmospheric pressure is declining, if we can keep the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli, here's 105, 97, 90, 84, 79, 74. So here we're at 10,000 feet. We're still in good shape because we're above 90% saturation when you're at that partial pressure of oxygen being 70 and above. So we can maintain good oxygenation at certain altitudes. When we start getting above 10,000 feet and we start seeing the partial pressure of oxygen decline dramatically, that's when we're going to see larger changes in our percent saturation. So the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve is basically a way to express the physical relationship between partial pressure of oxygen and how well hemoglobin carries oxygen. Again, the shape of the curve represents or reflects the properties of hemoglobin and how well it binds to oxygen. So it's sigmoidal rather than linear because of the way oxygen binds to hemoglobin. So when we talk about hemoglobin and oxygen binding, there is what we call a cooperative binding relationship. And that cooperative binding relationship determines the sigmoidal curve rather than a linear curve. So what is cooperative binding between oxygen and hemoglobin? Basically what that says, this property, is that when you bind one oxygen to the hemoglobin molecule, it causes a shape change in the protein structure. So when one oxygen binds, we get a shape change in the hemoglobin structure. And that makes it easier for the next oxygen to bind. It turns out that hemoglobin can bind 4 oxygens. So when the first oxygen binds, there's a shape change that's going to make it easier for the next oxygen to bind. Now that you have 2 oxygens bound, a shape change results in it making easier for the third oxygen to bind, and so forth for the fourth one. So it gets easier and easier for oxygen to bind. The same works when you unload oxygen. It's easier to remove the first oxygen. It's harder to remove the second oxygen, thus harder to remove the third one, harder to remove the fourth one. And so this affects our oxygen unloading and oxygen loading when we're talking about binding with hemoglobin. So looking at the dissociation curve, when you have a normal partial pressure of 100 millimeters of mercury of oxygen pressure, you're going to get about 98% saturation. But the curve is relatively flat as we drop in partial pressure, and so we can maintain high levels of oxygen saturation even when we get down to 60. So here's the partial pressure of oxygen at 60, and we're still right at that 90% mark. So we can maintain high levels of oxygen saturation even when the partial pressure of oxygen is declining, as long as we stay above 60 millimeters of mercury. When you drop below 60 millimeters of mercury, this is when you get into the steeper part of the dissociation curve. So you'll notice that when you're at 40, so between 40 and 60, we're starting to see a much more rapid decline. We're still in good shape. We're still above 70% saturation at 40 millimeters of mercury. This would be essentially venous blood. Venous blood approximates at about 40 millimeters of mercury partial pressure of oxygen. So even in our venous blood, we can maintain 70 to 75% oxygen saturation. So hemoglobin saturation is going to decline as we go from 60 to 40, and clearly it's going to decline even more rapidly when you get below 40. So say 40 to 20, we see a huge decline in saturation, but typically we're not going to be in those scenarios. So hemoglobin saturation declines from 60 to 40, it declines from 40, say, down to 20, and we're starting to see bigger losses, but we can still maintain fairly high hemoglobin saturation. So the physiological significance of the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve is that even at venous blood levels, we can maintain 70 to 75% hemoglobin to oxygen saturation, and that means that we have a reserve of oxygen in our venous system that we can then use when we're in hypoventilating scenarios. Besides the partial pressure of oxygen affecting the dissociation curve, we can also look at other factors that affect the dissociation curve. So let's take a look at other factors, other physical factors that alter hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen. So basically anything that can alter the shape of hemoglobin will affect its ability to bind oxygen. So the main things we're looking at are changes in pH, changes in temperature, changes in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and changes in the amount of a glycolytic molecule called 2,3-DPG. So this is basically a diphosphoglycerate. It's a bisphosphoglycerate that's produced in a pathway and a subsidiary pathway from glycolysis. So anything that changes the way hemoglobin binds oxygen will shift the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. So let's take a look at what's going on with these various factors. So let's take a look at effects of pH. When you have an increase in the amount of hydrogen ions, so when there's an increase in hydrogen ions, that means your pH is going to go down. There's a decrease in pH. When there's a decrease in pH or an increase in hydrogen ions, we see a shift to the right of the dissociation curve. So this is the normal curve seen here. And so this is a shift to the right. When you look at temperature, So when there's an increase in temperature, we see a shift to the right. So this is normal body temperature, 37 degrees C. This is an increase in temperature, so we see a shift to the right. When we see an increase in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, this is the normal curve. This is a shift to the right when there's an increase in the partial pressure of CO2. And also when we have an increase in the amount of 2,3-DPG. This is what we would call the Lubering-Rappaport pathway. It's basically we're going to convert 1,3-bisphosphate into 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate or 2,3-DPG. This is an offshoot of the glycolysis pathway, which is taking place inside red blood cells. And this molecule changes the way oxygen binds hemoglobin. So when there's an increase in this 2,3-DPG, when there's an increase in hydrogen ions, an increase in temperature, an increased partial pressure of CO2, we see the curve shifting to the right. What does that mean? Well, when there's a shift to the right, there's more oxygen unloading. So more oxygen unloading. We're going to release oxygen to our tissues more readily. So this occurs during exercise. This occurs when we are in high altitudes. This occurs because of anemia, diabetes, hypoventilation, COPD conditions, pneumothorax conditions, etc. There's various conditions that are going to lead to the body unloading more oxygen to the tissues so that the cells can have more oxygen available for ATP production. If we go back and look at the curves again, we can also look at shifts to the left. So here's again the normal curve, and we can look at the curve shifting to the left. Why would there be a shift to the left in the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve? Well, we're looking here at a decrease in hydrogen ions, which would increase pH, so make the body more alkaline, and that's going to shift the curve to the left. When we look at temperature, it's a decrease in temperature. So decrease in temperature shifts it to the left. Here we see the curve shifts to the left when there's a decrease in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. And we see the curve shift to the left when there's a decrease in this glycolytic molecule, or essentially no production of this offshoot molecule called 2,3-DPG. What's going on when you shift to the left? If the curve is shifting to the left, then there's going to be less oxygen released to the tissues. So there's going to be less oxygen unloading. So what are some conditions where there would be less oxygen unloading? This would be during hypothermia, so again, getting colder. When you're hyperventilating, vomiting can lead to less oxygen unloading. Dehydration can lead to less oxygen unloading. The consumption of alkaline products can lead to less oxygen unloading. And again, there are other conditions that can lead to less oxygen unloading. So to summarize, when you look at the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve, there are factors that can shift the curve to the right or to the left. So when it shifts right, we're talking about increased temperature, increased CO2, increased hydrogen ions, which lowers pH, makes it more acidic, and increased 2,3-DPG. When it's shifting to the left, we're looking at lower temperature, lower levels of carbon dioxide, lower levels of hydrogen ions, which would be an increase in pH, more alkaline, and no or lower levels of 2,3-DPG. When you shift to the right, you unload oxygen more freely. When you shift to the left, you hold on to oxygen. So there's less oxygen being released to the cells. So that's a little bit on gas transport in the respiratory system and how the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve works and things that affect the oxygen hemoglobin binding. I hope that helps. Take care.